Welcome to Livid and Low. Audiobook stream. Sun and Steel by Yukio Mishima. Apologies for the late start. There was a bit of a technical issue. I actually had believed for about 20 minutes I had been streaming, but I found out this was not the case. I would like to give a shout out to OBS for clearly telling me that I absolutely was not streaming to YouTube, just talking to myself for 20 minutes. That was a beautiful job they did there. Anyhow, moving on from that. Today I will be reading Sun and Steel by Yukio Mishima. As the title suggests, as the thumbnail, the picture suggests. I am doing this in honor of Mishima-sensei himself. As well, this week it is the 61st anniversary of Otoya Yamaguchi's killing of a communist party member in Japan. So, what better way to do my soft launch for the channel than to read Sun and Steel, one of the most nationalistic, if not the most nationalistic Japanese piece of literature there is. This is a relatively short autobiographical piece of literature, and I will attempt to do this as a single read through, but if it goes over 2 hours, I will probably stop and resume tomorrow, most likely. At the 1 hour mark, I will be taking an intermission break. At the end, if there is enough people, I will do discussion. And it is about time that I get into it. Before we start, there are no chapters in this book, so it's just kind of a stream of consciousness autobiography that he wrote. There is a closing portion, which I believe is a poem. I don't believe it is his poem. It could be. Correct me if I am wrong. But yes. Sun and Steel by Yukio Mishima. Of late I have come to sense within myself an accumulation of all kinds of things that cannot find adequate expression via an objective artistic form, such as the novel. A lyric poet of 20 might manage it, but I am 20 no longer, and have never been a poet at any rate. I have groped around, therefore, for some other form, more suited to such personal utterances, and have come up with a kind of hybrid between confession and criticism, a subtly equivocal mode that one might call confidential criticism. I see it as a twilight genre between the night of confession and the daylight of criticism. The I with which I shall occupy myself will not be the I that relates back strictly to myself, but something else, some residue that remains after all the other words I have uttered have flowed back into me, something that neither relates back nor flows back. As I pondered the nature of that I was driven to the conclusion that the I in question corresponded precisely with the physical space that I occupied. What I was seeking, in short, was the language of the body. If myself was my dwelling, then my body resembled an orchard that surrounded it. I could either cultivate that orchard to its capacity, or leave it for the weeds to run riot in. I was free to choose. But the freedom was not as obvious as it might seem. Many people, indeed, go so far as to refer to the orchards of their dwellings as destiny. One day it occurred to me to set about cultivating my orchard for all it was worth. For my purpose I used sun and steel, unceasing sunlight, and implements of fashioned steel became the chief elements in my husbandry. Little by little, the orchard began to bear fruit, and the thoughts of the body came to occupy a large part of my consciousness. All this did not occur, of course, overnight, nor did it begin without the existence of some deep-lying motive. I examined closely my early childhood, and I realized that my memory of words reaches back farther than my memory of the flesh. In the average person, I imagine, the body precedes language. In my case, words came first of all, then belatedly, with every appearance of extreme reluctance, and already clothed in concepts came the flesh. It was already, as it goes without saying, sadly wasted by words. First comes the pillar of plain wood, then the white ants that feed on it. But for me, the white ants were there from the start, and the pillar of plain wood emerged totally, already eaten halfway. Let the reader not chide me for comparing my own trade to the white ant. In its essence, any art that relies on words makes use of their ability to eat away of their corrosive function, just as etching depends on the corrosive power of nitric acid. Yet the simile is not accurate enough, for the copper and the nitric acid used in the etching are on par with each other, both being extracted from nature, while the relation of words to reality is not that of the acid to the plate. Words are a medium that reduces reality to abstraction for transmission to our reason, and in their power to corrode reality inevitably lurks the danger that the words themselves will be corroded too. It might be more appropriate, in fact, to liken their action to that of excess stomach fluids that digest and gradually eat away the stomach itself. Many people will express disbelief that such a process could already be at work in a person's earliest years. But that beyond doubt is what happened to me personally, thereby laying the ground for two contradictory tendencies within myself. One was the determination to press ahead loyally with the corrosive function of words, and to make that my life's work. The other was the desire to encounter reality in some field where words should play no part at all. In a more healthy process of development, the two tendencies can often work together without conflict. Even in the case of a born writer, giving rise to a highly desirable state of affairs in which a training in words leads to a fresh discovery of reality. But the emphasis here is on rediscovery. If this is to happen, it is necessary at the outset of life to have possessed the reality of the flesh still unsullied by words. And that is quite different from what happened to me. My composition teacher would often show his displeasure with my work, which was innocent of any words that might be taken as corresponding to reality. It seems that in my childish way, I had an unconscious presentiment of the subtle, fastidious laws of words, and was aware of the necessity of avoiding as far as possible coming into contact with reality by words, if one was to profit from their positive corrosive function and escape their negative aspect. If to put it more simply, one was to maintain the purity of words. I knew instinctively that the only possibility was to maintain a constant watch on the corrosive action, lest it suddenly come up against some object that it might corrode. The natural corollary of such a tendency was that I should openly admit the existence of reality in the body only in fields where words had no part whatsoever. Thus reality and body became synonymous for me, the objects almost a kind of fetishism. Without doubt, too, I was quite unconsciously expanding my interest in words to embrace this interest also. And this type of fetishism corresponded exactly to my fetish for words. In the first stage, I was quite obviously identifying myself with words and setting reality, the flesh, and action on the other side. There was no doubt either that my prejudice concerning words was encouraged by this willfully created antinomy, and that my deep-rooted misunderstanding of the nature of reality, the flesh, and action was formed in the same way. This antinomy rested on the assumption that I myself from the outset was devoid of the flesh, of reality, of action. It was true, indeed, that the flesh came late to me at the beginning, but I was waiting for it with words. I suspect that because of the earlier tendency I spoke of, I did not perceive it then as my body. If I had done so, my words would have lost their purity. I should have been violated by reality, and reality would have become inescapable. Interestingly enough, my stubborn refusal to perceive the body was itself due to a beautiful misconception in my idea of what the body was. I did not know that a man's body never shows itself as existence, but as I saw things, it ought to have made itself apparent, clearly and unequivocally, as existence. It naturally followed that when it did show itself unmistakably as a terrifying paradox of existence, as a form of existence that rejected existence, I was panic-stricken, as though I had come across some monster and loathed it accordingly. It never occurred to me that other men, all men without exception, were the same. It is perhaps only natural that this type of panic and fear, though so obviously the product of a misconception, should postulate another more desirable physical existence, another more desirable reality, never dreaming that the body existing in a form that rejected existence was universal in the male. I set about constructing my ideal hypothetical physical existence by investing it with all the opposite characteristics. And since my own abnormal bodily existence was doubtless a product of the intellectual corrosion of words, the ideal body, the ideal existence, must, I told myself, be absolutely free from any interference by words. Its characteristics could be summed up as taciturnity and beauty of form. At the same time, I decided that if the corrosive power of words had any creative function, it must find its model in the formal beauty of this ideal body, and that the ideal in the verbal arts must lie solely in the imitation of such physical beauty. In other words, the pursuit of a beauty that was absolutely free from corrosion. This was an obvious self-contradiction, since it represented an attempt to deprive words of their essential function, and to strip reality of its essential characteristics. Yet in another sense, it was an exceedingly clever and artful method of ensuring that words and the reality they should have dealt with never came face to face. In this way, my mind, without realizing what it was doing, straddled these two contradictory elements, and godlike set about trying to manipulate them. It was thus that I started writing novels, and this increased still my thirst for reality in the flesh. Later, much later, thanks to the Sun and Steel, I was to learn the language of the flesh, much as one might learn a foreign language. It was my second language, an aspect of my spiritual development. My purpose now is to talk of that development. As a personal history, it will, I suspect, be unlike anything seen before, and as such, exceedingly difficult to follow. When I was small, I would watch the young men parade the portable shrine through the streets at the local shrine festival. They were intoxicated with their task, and their expressions were of an indescribable abandon, their faces averted. Some of them even rested the backs of their necks against the shafts of the shrine that they shouldered, so that their eyes gazed up at the heavens, and my mind was much troubled by the riddle of what it was that those eyes reflected. As to the nature of the intoxicating vision that I detected in all this violent physical stress, my imagination provided no clue. For many a month, therefore, the enigma continued to occupy my mind. It was only much later, after I had begun to learn the language of the flesh, that I undertook to help in shouldering a portable shrine, and was at last able to solve the puzzle that had plagued me since infancy. They were simply looking at the sky. In their eyes, there was no vision, only the reflection of the blue and absolute skies of early autumn. Those blue skies, though, were unusual skies such as I might never see again in my life. One moment strung up high aloft, the next plunged into the depths, constantly shifting, a strange compound of lucidity and madness. I promptly set down what I had discovered in a short essay. So important did my experience seem to me. In short, I had found myself at a point where there were no grounds for doubting that the sky that my poetic intuition had shown me, and that the sky revealed to the eyes of those ordinary young men of the neighborhood, were identical. That moment, for which I had been waiting so long, was a blessing that the sun and steel had conferred on me. Why, you may ask, were there no grounds for doubt? Because, provided certain physical conditions are equal, and a certain physical burden shared, so long as an equal physical stress is savored and an identical intoxication overtakes all alike, and differences of individual sensibility are restricted by countless factors to an absolute minimum. If in addition, the introspective element is removed almost completely, then one is safe in asserting that what I had witnessed was no individual illusion, but one fragment of a well-defined group vision. My poetic intuition did not become a personal privilege until later, when I used words to recall and reconstruct that vision. My eyes, in their meeting with the blue sky, had penetrated to the essential pathos of the doer. And in that swaying blue sky, that like a fierce bird of prey with wings outstretched, alternately swept down and soared upward to infinity, I perceived the true nature of what I had long referred to as tragic. According to my definition of tragedy, the tragic pathos is born when the perfectly average sensibility momentarily takes unto itself a privileged nobility that keeps others at distance, and not when a special type of sensibility vaunts its own special claims. It follows that he who dabbles in words can create tragedy, but cannot participate in it. It is necessary, moreover, that the privileged nobility finds its basis strictly in a kind of physical courage. The element of intoxication and superhuman clarity in the tragic are born when the average sensibility, endowed with a given physical strength, encounters that type of privileged moment specially designed for it. Tragedy calls for an anti-tragic vitality and ignorance. Tragedy calls for an anti-tragic vitality and ignorance, and above all, for a certain inappropriateness. If a person is at times to draw close to the divine, then under normal circumstances he must be neither divine nor anything approaching it. It was only when I, in my turn, saw the strange divine blue sky perceived only by that type of person, that I at last trusted the universality of my own sensibility. that my thirst was slaked, that my morbidly blind faith in words was dispelled. At that moment, I participated in the tragedy of all being. Once I had gazed upon this sight, I understood all kinds of things hitherto unclear to me. The exercise of the muscles elucidated the mysteries that words had made. It was similar to the process of acquiring erotic knowledge. Little by little, I began to understand the feeling behind existence and action. If that were all, it would merely mean that I had trodden somewhat belatedly the same path as other people. I had another scheme of my own, however. Insofar as the spirit was concerned, I told myself there was nothing especially out of the way in the idea of some particular thought invading my spirit, enlarging it, and eventually occupying the whole of it. Since, however, I was gradually beginning to weary of the dualism of flesh and spirit, it naturally occurred to me to wonder why such an incident should occur within the spirit and come to an end at its outer fringes. There are, of course, many cases of psychosomatic diseases where the spirit extends its domain to the body. But what I was considering went further than this. Granted that my flesh in infancy had made itself apparent in intellectual guise, corroded by words, then should it not be possible to reverse the process, to extend the scope of an idea from the spirit to the flesh until the whole physical being became a suit of armor, forged from the metal of that concept? The idea in question, as I have already suggested in my definition of tragedy, resolved itself into the concept of the body, and it seemed to me that the flesh could be intellectualized to a higher degree and could achieve a closer intimacy with ideas than the spirit. For ideas are, in the long run, essentially foreign to human existence, and the body, receptacle of the involuntary muscles, of the internal organs and circulatory system, over which it has no control, is foreign to the spirit, so that it is even possible for people to use the body as a metaphor for ideas, both being something quite alien to human existence as such. And the way in which an idea can take possession of the mind unbidden, with the suddenness of a stroke of fate, reinforces still further the resemblance of ideas to the body with which each of us, willy-nilly, is endowed, giving even this automatic uncontrollable function a striking resemblance to the flesh. It is this that forms the basis of the idea of the enfleshment of Christ, and also the stigmata some people can produce on their palms and insteps. Nevertheless, the flesh has its limitations. Even should some eccentric idea require that a man sprout a pair of formidable horns on his head, they would obviously refuse to grow. The limiting factors ultimately are the harmony and balance on which the body insists. All these do is to provide beauty of the most average kind, and the physical qualifications necessary for viewing that swaying sky of the shrine bearers. They also, it seems, fulfill the function of taking revenge on and correcting any excessively eccentric idea, and they constantly draw one back to the point at which there is no longer any room to doubt one's identity with others. In this way, my body, while itself the product of an idea, would doubtless also serve as the best cloak with which to hide the idea. If the body could achieve perfect non-individual harmony, then it would be possible to shut individuality up forever in close confinement. I had always felt that such signs of physical individuality as a bulging belly, a sign of spiritual sloth, or a flat chest with protruding ribs, a sign of unduly nervous sensibility, were excessively ugly, and I could not contain my surprise when I discovered that there were people who loved such signs. To me, these could only seem acts of shameless indecency, as though the owner were exposing his spiritual pudenda on the outside of his body. They represented one type of narcissism that I could never forgive. The theme of the estrangement of body and spirit, born of the craving I have described, persisted for a long time as a principal theme in my work. I only came to take gradual leave of it when I at last began to consider whether it was not possible that the body too might have its own logic, possibly even its own thought. When I began to feel that the body's special qualities did not lie solely in taciturnity and beauty of form, but that the body too might have its own loquacity. When I describe in this fashion the shifts in these two strains of thought, the reader will surely say that I merely start taking where, if anything, generally accepted premises, and get involved in a maze of illogicality. The estrangement of body and spirit in modern society is almost an universal phenomenon, and there is nobody, the reader may feel, who would fail to deplore it. So that to prate emotionally about the body, thinking, or the loquacity of the flesh is going too far, and by using such phrases I am merely covering up my own confusion. In fact, by setting up my fetishes for reality and physical existence, and my fetish for words on the same level, by making them an exact equation, I had already brought into sight the discovery I was to make later. From the moment I set the wordless body full of physical beauty in opposition to the beautiful words that imitated physical beauty, thereby equating them as two things springing from one another and the same conceptual source, I had, in effect, without realizing it, already released myself from the spell of words, for it meant that I was reorganizing the identical origin of the formal beauty in the wordless body, and the formal beauty in words, and was beginning to seek a kind of Platonic idea that would make it possible to put the flesh and words on the same footing. At that stage, the attempt to project words onto the body was already only a stone's throw away. The attempt itself, of course, was strikingly unplatonic, but there remained only one more experience for me to pass through before I could start the internet. Damn it. Apologies for the sudden stop. My internet went out for a brief moment. I don't remember where I was. Here it. Okay. In order to explain what that was, I must start by describing the encounter between myself and the sun. In fact, this experience occurred on two occasions. It often happens that long before decisive meetings with a person from whom only death can thereafter part one, there is a brief brush elsewhere, with the same person occurring with almost total unawareness on both sides. So it was with my encounter with the sun. My first unconscious encounter was in the summer of the defeat in the year 1945. A relentless sun blazed down on the lush grass of that summer that lay on the borderline between the war and the post-war period. A borderline, in fact, that was nothing more than a line of barbed wire entanglements, half broken down, half buried in the summer weeds, tilting in all directions. I walked in the sun's rays, but had no clear understanding of the meaning they held for me. Fine-spun and impartial, the summer sunlight poured down prodigally on all creation alike. The war ended, yet the deep green weeds were lit exactly as before by merciless light of noon. A clearly perceived hallucination stirring in a slight breeze, brushing the tips of the leaves with my fingers. I was astonished that they did not vanish at my touch. That same sun, as the days turned to months and the months to years, had become associated with a pervasive corruption and destruction. In part, it was the way it gleamed so encouragingly on the wings of planes leaving on missions, on forests of bayonets, on the badges of military caps, on the embroidery of military banners, but still more, far more, it was the way it glistened on the blood flowing ceaselessly from the flesh, and on the silver bodies of flies clustering on wounds, holding sway over corruption, leading youth in droves to its death in tropical seas and countrysides. The sun lorded it over, with that vast, rusty red ruin that stretched away to the distant horizon. I little dreamed, since the sun had never been disassociated from the image of death, that it could ever confer on me a bodily blessing, even though it had, of course, long harbored images of radiant glory. I was already 15, and I had written a poem. And still the light pours down, men laud the day. I shun the sun, and cast my soul into the shadowy pit. How dearly indeed I loved my pit, my dusky room, the area of my desk with its piles of books. How I enjoyed introspection, shrouded myself in cogitation. With what rapture did I listen for the rustling of frail insects in thickets of my nerves. My hostility towards the sun was my only rebellion against the spirit of the age. I hankered after Novalis' night and Yeatsian Irish twilights. However, from that time the war ended, I gradually sensed that an era was approaching in which to treat the sun as an enemy would be tantamount to following the herd. The literary works written or put before the public around that time were dominated by night thoughts. Though their night was far less aesthetic than mine, to be really respected at that time, moreover, one's darkness had to be rich and cloying, not thin. Even the rich honeyed night, in which I myself had wallowed in my boyhood, seemed to them, apparently, very thin stuff indeed. Little by little, I began to feel uncertain about the night in which I had placed such trust during the war, and to suspect that I might have belonged to the sun worshippers all along. It may well have been so. And it was indeed so. I began to wonder, might not my persistent hostility towards the sun and the continued importance I attached to my own small private night be no more than a desire to follow the herd? The men who indulged in nocturnal thought, it seems to me, had without exception dry, lusterless skins and sagging stomachs. They sought to wrap up a whole epoch in a capacious night of ideas, and rejected them all its forms, the sun that I had seen. They rejected both life and death, as I had seen them. For in both of these, the sun had a hand. It was in 1952, on the deck of a ship on which I made my first journey abroad, that I exchanged a reconciliatory handshake with the sun. From that day on, I found myself unable to part company with it. The sun became associated with the main highway of my life. And little by little, it tanned my skin brown, branding me as a member of the other race. One might object that thought belongs, essentially, to the night, that creation with words is of necessity carried out in the fevered darkness of night. Indeed, I had still not lost my old habit of working through the small hours, and I was surrounded by people whose skins unmistakably bore witness to nocturnal thinking. Yet why must it be that men always seek out the depths of the abyss? Why must thought, like a plumb line, concern itself exclusively with vertical descent? Why was it not feasible for thought to change direction and climb vertically up, ever up, towards the surface? Why should the area of the skin, which guarantees a human being's existence in space, be the most despised and left to the tender mercies of the senses? I could not understand the laws governing the motion of thought, the way it was liable to get stuck in unseen chasms whenever it set out to go deep, or whenever it aimed at the heights to soar away into boundless and equally invisible heavens, having the corporeal form undeservedly neglected. Yet the law of thought is that it should search out profundity, whether it extends upward or downward. Then it seemed excessively logical to me that men should not discover depths of a kind in the surface, that vital borderline that endorses our separateness and our form, dividing our exterior from our interior. Why should they not be attracted by the profundity of the surface itself? The sun was enticing, almost dragging my thoughts away from the night of visceral sensations, away to the swelling of muscles encased in the sunlit skin. And it was commanding me to construct a new and sturdy dwelling, in which my mind, as it rose little by little to the surface, could live in security. That dwelling was a tanned, lustrous skin, and powerful, sensitively rippling muscles. I came to feel that it was precisely because such an abode was required that the average intellectual failed to feel at home with thought that concerned itself with forms and surfaces. The nocturnal outlook, product of diseased inner organs, is given shape almost before its owner is aware which came first, the outlook itself, or those first faint morbid symptoms in the inner organs. And yet, in remote recesses, invisible to the eye, the body slowly creates and regulates its own thought. With the surface, on the other hand, which is visible to everybody, training of the body must take precedence over training of thought if it is to create and supervise its own ideas. The need for me to train my body could have been foreseen from that moment when I first felt the attraction of the surface profundities. I was aware that the only thing that could justify such an idea was muscle. Who pays any attention to a physical education theorist grown decrepit? One might accept the pallid scholar's toying with nocturnal thoughts in the privacy of his study, but what could seem more meager, more chilly, than his lips were they to speak, whether in praise or in blame of the body? So well acquainted was I with poverty of that type that one day, quite suddenly, it occurred to me to acquire ample muscles of my own. I would draw attention here to one fact, that everything, as this shows, proceeded from my mind. I believe that just as physical training will transform supposedly involuntary muscles into voluntary ones, so a similar transformation can be achieved through training the mind, both body and mind, through an inevitable tendency that one might almost call a natural law, are inclined to lapse into automatism. But I have found, by experience, that a large stream may be deflected by digging a small channel. This is another example of the quality that our spirits and bodies have in common. That tendency shared by the body and the mind so instantly create their own small universe, their own false order, whenever at one particular time they are taken control of by one particular idea. Although what happens, in fact, represents a kind of standstill. It is experienced as though it were a burst of lively, centripetal activity. This function of the body and mind in creating for a short while their own miniature universes is in fact no more than an illusion. Yet the fleeting sense of happiness in human life owes much to precisely this type of false order. It is a kind of protective function of life in the face of the chaos around it, and resembles the way a hedgehog rolls itself up into a tight round ball. The possibility then presented itself of breaking down one type of false order and creating another in its place, of turning back on itself this obstinate formative function and resetting it in direction that better accorded with one's own aims. This idea, I decided, I would immediately put into action. Rather than idea, though I might have said the new purpose which the sun provided me with each day. It was thus that I found myself confronted with those lumps of steel, heavy, forbidding, cold, as though the essence of night had in them been still further condensed. On that day began my close relationship with steel that was to last for 10 years to come. The nature of this steel is odd. I found that as I increased its weight little by little, the effect was like a pair of scales. The bulk of muscles placed, as it were, on the other pan, increased proportionately, as though the steel had a duty to maintain a strict balance between the two. Little by little, moreover, the properties of my muscles came increasingly to resemble those of the steel. This slow development, I found, was remarkably similar to the process of education which remodels the brain intellectually, by feeding it with progressively more difficult matter. And since there were always the vision of a classical idea of the body to serve as a model and an ultimate goal, the process closely resembled the classical idea of education. And yet, which of the two was it that really resembled the other? Was I not already using words in my attempt to imitate the classical physical archetype? For me, beauty is always retreating from one's grasp. The only thing I consider important is what existed once, or ought to have existed. By its subtle, infinitely varied operation, the steel restored the classical balance that the body had begun to lose, reinstating it in its natural form, the form that it should have had all along. The groups of muscles that have become virtually unnecessary in modern life, though still a vital element of a man's body, are obviously pointless from a practical point of view. And bulging muscles are as unnecessary as a classical education is to the majority of practical men. Muscles have gradually become something akin to classical Greek. To revive the dead language, the discipline of steel was required. To change the silence of death into the eloquence of life, the aid of steel was essential. The steel faithfully taught me the correspondence between the spirit and the body. Thus feeble emotions, it seemed to me, corresponded to flaccid muscles, sentimentality to a sagging stomach, and over-impressionability to an oversensitive white skin, bulging muscles, a taut stomach, and tough skin, I reasoned, would correspond respectively to an intrepid fighting spirit, the power of dispassionate intellectual judgment, and a robust disposition. I hasten to point out that here, I do not believe ordinary people to be like this. Even my own scanty experience is enough to furnish me with innumerable examples of timid minds encased within bulging muscles. Yet, as I have already pointed out, words for me came before flesh, so that intrepidity, dispassionateness, robustness, and all those emblems of moral character, summed up by words, needed to manifest themselves in outward bodily tokens. For that reason, I told myself, I ought to endow myself with the physical characteristics in question as a kind of educative process. Beyond the educative process, there also lurked another romantic design. The romantic impulse that had formed an undercurrent in me from boyhood on, and that made sense only as a destruction of classical perfection lay waiting within me. Like a theme in an operatic overture that is later destined to occur throughout the whole work, it laid down a definitive pattern for me before I had achieved anything in practice. Specifically, I cherished a romantic impulse towards death. Yet at the same time, I required a strictly classical body as the vehicle. A peculiar sense of destiny made me believe that the reason why my romantic impulse towards death remained unfulfilled in reality was the immensely simple fact that I lacked the necessary physical qualifications. A powerful, tragic frame and sculpture-esque muscles were indispensable in a romantically noble death. Any confrontation between weak, flabby flesh and death seemed to me absurdly inappropriate. Longing at 18 for an early demise, I felt myself unfitted for it. I lacked, in short, the muscles suitable for a dramatic death, and it deeply offended my romantic pride that it should be this unsuitability that had permitted me to survive the war. For all that, these purely intellectual convolutions were as yet nothing but the entangling of themes within the prelude to a human life that so far had achieved nothing. It remained for me some day to achieve something, to destroy something, and that was where the steel came in. It was the steel that gave me a clue as to how to do so. At the point at which many people feel satisfied with the degree of intellectual cultivation they have already achieved, I was fated to discover that in my case, the intellect, far from being a harmless cultural asset, had been granted me solely as a weapon, as a means of survival. Thus the physical disciplines that later became so necessary to my survival were in a sense comparable to the way in which a person for whom the body has been the only means of living launches into a frantic attempt to acquire an intellectual education when his youth is on his deathbed. The steel taught me many different things, It gave me an utterly new kind of knowledge, a knowledge that neither books nor worldly experience can impart. Muscles, I found, were strength as well as form, and each complex of muscles was subtly responsible for the direction in which its own strength was exerted, much as though they were rays of light, given the form of flesh. Nothing could have accorded better with a definition of a work of art that I long cherished than this concept of form enfolding strength, coupled with the idea that a work should be organic, radiating rays of light in all directions. The muscles that I thus created were at one and the same time simple existence and works of art. They even paradoxically possessed a certain abstract nature. Their one fatal flaw was that they were too closely involved with the life process, which decreed that they should decline and perish with the decline of life itself. This oddly abstract nature I will return to later. More important here is the fact that, for me, muscles had one of the most desirable qualities of all. Their function was precisely opposite to that of words. This will become clear if one considers the origin of words themselves. At first, in much the same way as stone coinage, words become current among the members of a race, as a universal means to the communication of emotions and needs. So long as they remain unsoiled by handling, they are common property, and they can accordingly express nothing but commonly shared emotions. However, as words become particularized, and as men begin, in however small a way, to use them in personal arbitrary ways, so their transformation into art begins. It was words of this kind that, descending on me like a swarm of winged insects, seized on my individuality and sought to shut me up within it. Nevertheless, despite the enemy's depredations upon my person, I turned their universality, at once a weapon and a weakness, back on them, and to some extent succeeded in using words to universalize my own individuality. That success lay in being different from others, and was essentially at variance with the origins and early development of words. Nothing, in fact, is so strange as the glorification of verbal arts, seeming at first glance to strive after universality. In fact, they concern themselves with the subtle ways of betraying the fundamental function of words, which is to be universally applicable. The glorification of individual style in literature signifies precisely that. The epic poems of ancient times are perhaps an exception, but every literary work, with its author's name standing at its head, is no more than a beautiful perversion of words. Can the blue sky that we all see, the mysterious blue sky that is seen identically by all the bearers of the festival shrine, ever be given verbal expression? It was here, as I have already said, that my deepest doubts lay, and conversely what I found in muscles, through the immediacy of steel, was a burgeoning of this type of triumph of the non-specific, the triumph of knowing that one was the same as others, and the relentless pressure of the steel progressively stripped my muscles of their unusualness and individuality, which were a product of degeneration. And as they gradually developed, they should, I reasoned, begin to assume a universal aspect, until finally they reached a point where they conformed to a general pattern in which individual differences ceased to exist. The universality thus attained would suffer no private corrosion, no betrayal. That was its most desirable trait in my eyes. In addition, those muscles so apparent to the eye, so palpable to the touch, began to acquire an abstract quality all their own. Muscles, of which non-communication is the very essence, ought never in theory to acquire the abstract quality common to the means of communication. And yet, One summer day, heated by training, I was cooling my muscles in the breeze, coming through an open window. The sweat vanished, as though by magic, and coolness passed over the surface of the muscles like a touch of menthol. The next instant, I was rid of the sense of muscles' existence. And in the same way that words, by their abstract functioning, can grind at the concrete world so that the words themselves seem never to have existed, my muscles at that moment crushed something within my being, so that it was as though the muscles themselves had similarly never existed. What was it, then, that they had crushed? It was that sense of existence in which we normally believe in such a half-hearted manner, which they had transformed into a kind of transparent sense of power. It is this that I refer to as their abstract nature, as my resort to the steel had persistently suggested to me. The relationship of muscles to steel was one of interdependence, very similar in fact to the relationship between ourselves and the world. In short, the sense of existence by which strength cannot be strength without some object represents the basic relationship between ourselves and the world. It is precisely to that extent that we depend on the world, and that I depended on steel. Just as muscles slowly increase their resemblance to steel, so we are gradually fashioned by the world. And although neither the steel nor the world can very well possess a sense of their own existence, idle analogy leads us unwittingly into the illusion that both do, in fact, possess such a sense. Otherwise, we feel powerless to check up on our own sense of existence. An atlas, for example, would gradually come to regard the globe on his shoulders as something akin to himself. Thus our sense of existence seeks after some object, and can only live in a false world of relativity. It is true enough that when I lifted a certain weight of steel, I was able to believe in my own strength. I sweated and panted, struggling to obtain certain proof of my strength. At such times the strength was mine, and equally it was the steel's. My sense of existence was feeding on itself. Away from the steel, however, my muscles seemed to lapse into absolute isolation. Their bulging shapes, no more than cogs created to mesh with the steel. The cool breeze passed, the sweat evaporated, and with them the existence of the muscles vanished into thin air. And yet, it was then that the muscles played their most essential function, grinding up with their sturdy invisible teeth that ambiguous relative sense of existence, and then substituting it for an unqualified sense of transparent, peerless power that required no object at all. Even the muscles themselves no longer existed. I was enveloped in a sense of power as transparent as light. It is scarcely to be wondered at that in this pure sense of power that no amount of books or intellectual analysis could ever capture, I should discover a true antithesis of words. And indeed it was this that by gradual stages was to become the focus of my whole thinking. We have now reached the 1 hour mark, and there is a paragraph break here, so I will be taking my intermission. I will return in about 5 minutes. Alright, I have returned, and we will continue. The formulation of any new way of thought begins with the trial rephrasing in many different ways of a single, as yet ambiguous theme. As the fisherman tries all kinds of rods, and the fencer all kinds of bamboo and swords, until he finds one whose length and weight suit him. So, in the formulation of a way of thinking, an as yet imprecise idea is given experimental expression in a variety of forms. Only when the right measurements and weight are discovered does it become part of oneself. When I experienced that pure sense of strength, I had a presentiment that here at last was a future focus of my thought. The idea gave me indescribable pleasure, and I looked forward to dallying with it in a leisurely fashion before appropriating it to myself as a way of thinking. I would take my time spinning out the process, taking care to prevent the idea from becoming set, and all the while experimenting with different various formulations. And by means of many trials, I would recapture that pure sensation and confirm its nature, much as a dog attracted by the basic aroma of good food given off by a bone prolongs the spell it is under by playing with the bone. For me, the attempts at rephrasing took the form of boxing and fencing, about which I will say more later. It was natural that my rephrasing of the pure sense of strength should turn in the direction of the flash of the fist and the stroke of the bamboo sword. For that which lay at the end of the flashing fist and beyond the blow of the bamboo sword was precisely what constituted the most certain proof of that invisible light given off by the muscles. It was an attempt to reach the ultimate sensation that lies just a hair's breadth beyond the reach of the senses. Something, I felt sure, lurked in the empty space that lay there. Even with the aid of that sense of pure power, it was possible only to reach a point one step this side of that thing. With the intellect or the artistic intuition, it was not even possible to get within 10 or 20 paces. Art, admittedly, could probably give expression to it in some form or other, yet expression requires a medium. In my case, it seemed the abstract function of the words that would serve as the medium had the effect of being a barrier to everything else. And it seemed unlikely that the act of expression would satisfy one who had been motivated at the outset by doubts about that very act. It is not surprising that the anathema for words should draw one's attention to the essentially dubious nature of the act of expression. Why do we conceive the desire to give expression to things that cannot be said, and sometimes succeed? Such success is a phenomenon that occurs when a subtle arrangement of words excites the reader's imagination to an extreme degree. At that moment, author and reader become accomplices in a crime of the imagination. And when their complicity gives rise to a work of literature, that thing that is not a thing, people call that thing that is not a thing, people call it creation, and inquire no further. In actual fact, words, armed with their abstract function, originally put in their appearance as a working of the logos, designed to bring order to the chaos of the world of concrete objects, and expression was essentially an attempt to turn the abstract functioning back on itself, and, like an electric current that flows in reverse, summon up a world of phenomena with the aid of words alone. It was in accordance with this idea that I suggested earlier that all works of literature were a kind of beautiful transformation of language. Expression, by its very function, means the recreation of a world with concrete objects using language alone. How many lazy men's truths have been admitted in the name of imagination? How often has the term imagination been used to prettify the unhealthy tendency of the soul to soar off into a boundless quest after truth, leaving the body where it always was? How often have men escaped from the pains of their own bodies with the aid of that sentimental aspect of the imagination that feels the ills of others' flesh as its own? And how often has the imagination unquestioningly exalted spiritual sufferings, whose relative value was in fact excessively difficult to gauge? And when this type of arrogance of the imagination links together the artist's act of expression and its accomplices, there comes into existence a kind of fictional thing, the work of art. And it is this interference from the larger number of such things that has steadily perverted and altered reality. As a result, men end up by coming into contact with shadows and lose courage to make themselves at home with the tribulations of their own flesh. That which lurked beyond the flash of the fist and the stroke of the fencing sword was at the opposite pole from verbal expression. That much, at least, was apparent from the feeling it conveyed of being the essence of something extremely concrete, the essence, even, of reality. In no sense at all could it be called a shadow. Beyond the fist, beyond the tip of the bamboo sword, a new reality had reared its head, a reality that rejected all attempts to make it abstract. Indeed, that flatly rejected all expression of phenomena by resort to abstractions. There above all lay the essence of action and of power. That reality, in popular parlance, was referred to quite simply as the opponent. The opponent and I dwelt in the same world. When I looked, the opponent was seen. When the opponent looked, I was seen. We faced each other. Moreover, without any intermediary imagination, both belonging to the same world of action and strength, the world that is of being seen. The opponent was in no sense an idea, for although by climbing step by step up the ladder of verbal expression in pursuit of an idea, and by gazing intently at the idea, we may well succeed in blinding ourselves to the light, that idea will never gaze back at us. In a realm where at every moment one's gaze is returned, one is never given time to express things in words. In order to express oneself, one needs to stand outside the world in question. Since that world as a whole never returns one's scrutiny, one is given time to look, and to express at leisure what one has found. But one will never succeed in getting at the essence of a reality that returns one's gaze. It was the opponent that lurked in the empty space beyond the flash of the fist and the blow of the fencing sword, gazing back at one, that constituted the true essence of things. Ideas do not stare back, things do. Beyond verbal expressions, ideas can be seen flitting behind the semi-transparency of the fictional things that they have achieved. Beyond action, one may glimpse, flittering behind the semi-transparent space it has achieved, the opponent, the thing. To the man of action, that thing appears as death, which bears down on him, the great black bull of the toreador, without any agency of the imagination. Even so, I cannot bring myself to believe in it, except when it appeared at the very extremity of consciousness. I had perceived dimly, too, that the only physical proof of the existence of consciousness was suffering. Beyond doubt, there was a certain splendor in pain, which bore a deep affinity to the splendor that lies hidden within strength. It is common experience that no technique of action can become effective until repeated practice has drummed it into the unconscious areas of the mind. What I was interested in, however, was something slightly different. On the one hand, my desire to have pure experience of consciousness was staked on the body strength action series, while on the other hand, my passion for pure experience was staked on the given moment, when thanks to the reflex action of the pre-trained subconscious, the body put forth its highest skill. And the only thing that truly attracted me was the point at which these two mutually opposed attempts coincided. The point of contact, in other words, at which the absolute value of consciousness and the absolute value of the body fitted exactly into each other. The befuddling of the wits by means of drugs or alcohol was not, of course, my aim. My only interest lay in following consciousness through to its extreme limits. So, as to discover at what point it was converted into unconscious power, that being so, what surer witness to the persistence of consciousness to its outer limits could I have found than physical suffering? There is an undeniable interdependence between consciousness and physical suffering, and consciousness, conversely, affords the surest possible proof of the persistence of bodily distress. Pain, I came to feel, might well prove to be the sole proof of the persistence of the consciousness within the flesh, the sole physical expression of the consciousness. As my body acquired muscle and in turn strength, there was gradually born within me a tendency towards the positive acceptance of pain, and my interest in physical suffering deepened. Even so, I would not have it believed that this development was a result of the workings of my imagination. My discovery was made directly with my body, thanks to the sun and steel. As many people must have experienced for themselves, the greater the accuracy of a blow from the boxing glove or a fencing sword, the more it is felt as a counter blow rather than as a direct assault on the opponent's person. One's own blow, one's own strength, creates a kind of hollow. A blow is successful if at that instant the opponent's body fits into the hollow in space and assumes a form precisely identical with it. How is it that a blow can be experienced in such a way? What makes a blow successful? Success comes from when both the timing and placing of the blow are just right. But more than this, it happens when the choice of time and target and one's judgment manages to catch the foe momentarily off guard. When one has an intuitive apprehension of that off-guard moment, a fraction of a second before it becomes perceptible to the senses. This apprehension is a quantity that is unknowable even to the self, and is acquired through a process of long training. By the time the right moment is consciously perceptible, it's already too late. It is too late, in other words, when that which lurks in the space beyond the flashing fist and the tip of the sword has taken shape. By the moment it takes shape, it must already be snugly ensconced in that hollow space that one has marked out and created. It is at this instant that victory in the fray is born. The height of the fray, I found, the tardy process of creating muscle, whereby strength creates form and form creates strength, is repeated so swiftly that it becomes imperceptible to the eye. Strength that, like light, emitted its own rays, was constantly renewed, destroying and creating form as it went. I saw for myself how the form that was beautiful and fitting overcame the form that was ugly and imprecise. Its distortion invariably implied an opening for the foe and a blurring of the rays of strength. The defeat of the foe occurs when he accommodates his form to the hollow in space that one is already marked out. At that moment, one's own form must preserve a constant precision and beauty, and the form itself must have an extreme adaptability, a matchless flexibility, so that it resembles a series of sculptures created from moment to moment by a fluid body. The continuous radiation of strength must create its own shape, just as a continuous jet of water will maintain the shape of a fountain. Surely, I felt, the tempering by sun and steel to which I submitted over such a long period was none other than a process of creating this kind of fluid sculpture. And in so far as the body thus fashioned belonged strictly to life, its whole value, I came to feel, must lie in that moment-to-moment splendor. That indeed is the reason why human sculpture has striven so hard to commemorate the momentary glory of the flesh in imperishable marble. It followed that death lay only a short way beyond that particular moment. Here I felt I was gaining a clue to an inner understanding of the cult of the hero. The cynicism that regards all hero worship as comical is always shadowed by a sense of physical inferiority. Invariably, it is the man who believes himself to be physically lacking in heroic attributes who speaks mockingly of the hero. And when he does so, how dishonest it is that his phraseology, partaking ostensibly of a logic so universal and general, should not, or at least should be assumed by the general public not to, give any clue to his physical characteristics. I have yet to hear hero worship mocked by a man endowed with what might be justly called heroic physical attributes. Facile cynicism, invariably, is related to feeble muscles or obesity, while the cult of the hero and mighty nihilism are always related to a mighty body and well-tempered muscles. For the cult of the hero is ultimately the basic principle of the body, and in the long run is intimately involved with the contrast between the robustness of the body and the destruction that is death. The body carries quite sufficient persuasion to destroy the comic aura that surrounds an excessive self-awareness. For though a fine body may be tragic, there is in it no trace of the comic. The thing that ultimately saves the flesh from being ridiculous is the element of death that resides in the healthy, vigorous body. It is this, I realized, that sustains the dignity of the flesh. How comic would one find the gaiety and elegance of the bullfighter were his trade entirely divorced from associations of death? Nevertheless, whenever one sought after the ultimate sensation, the moment of victory was always an insipid sensation. Ultimately, the opponent, the reality that stares back at one, is death. Since death, it seems, will yield to no one, the glory of victory can be nothing more than a purely worldly glory in its highest form. And if it is only a worldly glory, I told myself, then one ought to be able to secure something very similarly to it by resorting to the verbal arts. Yet the thing that we sense in the finest sculpture, as in the bronze charioteer of Delphi, where the glory, the pride, and the shyness reflected in the moment of victory are given faithfully immortality, is the swift approach of the specter of death, just on the other side of the victor. At the same time, by showing us symbolically the limits of spatiality and the art of sculpture, it intimates that nothing but decline lies beyond the greatest human glory. The sculptor, in his arrogance, has sought to capture life only at its supreme moment. If the solemnity and dignity of the body arise solely from the element of mortality that lurks within it, then the road leads to death, I reasoned. And the road that leads to death, I reasoned, must have some private path connecting with pain, suffering, and a continuing consciousness that is proof of life. And I could not help feeling that if there were some incident in which violent death pangs and well-developed muscles were skillfully combined, it could only occur in response to the aesthetic demands of destiny. Not, of course, that destiny often lends an ear to aesthetic considerations. Even in my boyhood, I was not unfamiliar with various types of physical distress, but the addled brains and oversensitivity of adolescence confused them hopelessly and with spiritual suffering. As a middle school boy, a forced march from Gora to Sengokobara, then over to Otome Pass, to the plain at the foot of Mount Fuji, was an undoubted rival. But all I extracted from my tribulations was a passive mental type of suffering. I lacked the physical courage to seek out suffering for myself, to take the pain unto myself. The acceptance of suffering as a proof of courage was the theme of primitive initiation rites in the distant past, and all such rites were at the same time ceremonies of death and resurrection. Men have now forgotten the profound hidden struggle between consciousness and the body that exists in courage, and physical courage in particular. Consciousness is generally considered to be passive, and the active body to constitute the essence of all that is bold and daring. Yet in the drama of physical courage, the roles are in fact reversed. The flesh beats a steady retreat into its function of self-defense, while it is clear consciousness that controls the decision that sends the body soaring into self-abandonment. It is the ultimate in clarity of consciousness that constitutes one of the strongest contributing factors to self-abandonment. To embrace suffering is the constant role of physical courage, and physical courage is, as it were, the source of that taste for understanding and appreciating death that, more than anything else, is a prime condition for making true awareness of death possible. However, much the closeted philosopher mulls over the idea of death, so long as he remains divorced from the physical courage that is a prerequisite for the awareness of it. He will remain unable even to begin to grasp it. I must make it clear that I am talking of physical courage. The conscience of the intellectual and intellectual courage are no concern of mine here. Nevertheless, the fact remains that I was living in an age when the fencing sword was no longer a direct symbol of the real sword, and the real sword in swordplay sliced through nothing but air. The art of fencing was a summation of every type of manly beauty, yet insofar as that manliness was no longer of any practical use in society, it was scarcely distinguishable from art that depended solely on the imagination. Imagination I detested. For me, fencing ought to be something that admitted of no intervention by the imagination. The cynics, well aware that there is nobody who despises the imagination so thoroughly as the dreamer, whose dreams are a process of the imagination, will, I am sure, scoff at my confession in their own minds. Yet my dreams became, at some stage, my muscles, the muscles that I had made, that existed, might give scope for the imagination of others, but no longer admitted of being gnawed away by my own imagination. I had reached a stage where I was rapidly making acquaintance with the world of those who are seen. If it was a special property of muscles that they fed the imagination of others while remaining totally devoid of imagination themselves, then in fencing I was seeking to go one step further and achieve pure action that admitted of no imagination, either by the self or by others. Sometimes it seemed that my wish had been fulfilled, and others that it had not. Yet, either way, it was physical strength that fought and ran fleet of foot, that cried aloud. How did the groups of muscles, normally so heavy, so dark, so unchangingly static, know the moment of white-hot frenzy in action? I loved the freshness of the consciousness that rippled unceasingly beneath spiritual tension, whatever kind that might be. I could no longer believe that it was purely an intellectual quality of my own, that the copper of excitement should be lined with the silver of awareness. It was this that made frenzy what it was. For I had begun to believe that it was the muscles, powerful, statically so well organized and so silent, that were the true source of the clarity of my consciousness. The occasional pain in the muscles of a blow that missed the shield gave rise instantly to a still together, tougher consciousness that suppressed the pain. An imminent shortage of breath gave rise to a frenzy that conquered it. Thus I glimpsed from time to time another sun quite different from that by which I had been so long blessed. A sun full of fierce, dark flames of feeling. A sun of death that would never burn the skin, yet gave forth, still, a stranger glow. This second sun was essentially far more dangerous to the intellect than the first sun had ever been. It was this danger, more than anything else, that delighted me. What now of my dealings with words during this same period? By now I had made of my style something appropriate to my muscles. It had become flexible and free. All fatty embellishment had been stripped from it, while muscular ornament that is, that though possibly without use in modern civilization, was still as necessary as ever for purposes of prestige and presentability, had been assiduously maintained. I disliked a style that was merely functional, as much as one that was merely sensuous. Nevertheless, I was on an isolated island of my own. Just as my body was isolated, so my style was on the verge of non-communication. It was a style that did not accept, but rejected. More than anything, I was preoccupied with distinction. Not that my own style necessarily had it. My ideal style would have had the grave beauty of polished wood in the entrance hall of a samurai mansion on a winter's day. In my style, as hardly needs pointing out, I progressively turned my back on the preferences of the age, abounding in antithesis, clothed in old-fashioned, weighty solemnity. It did not lack mobility of a kind, but maintained the same ceremonial grave pace wherever it went, marching through other people's bedrooms with precisely the same tread everywhere. Like some military gentleman, it went about with chest out and shoulders back, despising other men's styles, for the way they stooped, sagged at the knees, and even, heaven forbid, swayed at the hips. I knew, of course, that there are some truths in this world that one cannot see unless one unbends one's posture. but such things could be well left to others. Somewhere within me, I was beginning to plan a union of art and life, of style and of ethos, of action. If style was similar to muscles and patterns of behavior, then its function was obviously to restrain the wayward imagination. Any truths that might be overlooked, as a result, were no concern of mine. Nor did I care one jot that the fear and horror of confusion and ambiguity eluded my style. I had made up my mind that I would select only one particular truth, and avoid aiming at any all-inclusive truth. Enervating, ugly truths I ignored. By means of a process of diplomatic selection within the spirit, I sought to avoid the morbid influence exerted on men by indulgence of the imagination. Nevertheless, it was dangerous, obviously, to underestimate or ignore its influence. There was no telling when the sickly forces of an invisible imagination, still lying in wait, might launch their cowardly assault from without the carefully arrayed fortifications of style. Day and night I stood guard at the ramparts. Occasionally something, a red fire, would flare up like a signal on a dark plain, stretching endlessly into the night before me. I would try to tell myself that it was a bonfire. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the fire would vanish again. As guard and weapon against imagination and its henchman sensibility, I had style. The tension of the all-night watch, whether by land or by sea, was what I sought after in my style. More than anything, I detest defeat. Can there be any worse defeat than when one is corroded and seared from within by the acid secretions of sensibility until finally one loses one's outline, dissolves, liquefies, or when the same thing happens to the society about one, and one alters one's own style to match it? Everyone knows that masterpieces, ironically enough, sometimes arise from the midst of such defeat, from the death of the spirit, though I might retreat a pace and admit such masterpieces as victory. I knew that they were victories without a struggle, battleless victories of a kind of peculiar to art. What I sought was the struggle as such, whichever way it might go. I had no taste for defeat, much less victory, without a fight. At the same time, I knew only too well the deceitful nature of any kind of conflict in art. If I must have a struggle, I felt I should take the offensive in fields outside art, in art. I should defend my citadel. It was necessary to be a sturdy defender within art, and a good fighter outside of it. The goal of my life was to acquire all the various attributes of the warrior. During the post-war period, when all accepted values were upset, I often thought and remarked to others that now, if ever, was the time for reviving the old Japanese ideal of a combination of letters and the martial arts, of arts and action. For a while after that, my interest strayed from the particular ideal. Then, as I gradually learned from the sun and the steel the secret of how to pursue words with the body, and not merely pursue the body with words, the two poles within me began to maintain a balance, and the generator of my mind, so to speak, switched from a direct to an alternating current. My mind devised a system that, by installing within the self two mutually antipathetic elements, two elements that flowed alternately in opposite directions, gave the appearance of inducing an ever wider split in the personality, yet in practice created at each moment a living balance that was constantly being destroyed and brought back to life again. the embracing of a dual polarity within the self, and the acceptance of a contradiction and collision. Such was my own blend of art and action. In this way, it seemed to me, my long-standing interest in the opposite of the literary principle began for the first time to bear fruit. The principle of the sword, it seemed, lay in its allying death not with pessimism and impotence, but with the abounding energy, the flower of physical perfection, and the will to fight. Nothing could be farther removed from the principle of literature. In literature, death is held in check, yet at the same time used as a driving force. Strength is devoted to the construction of empty fictions. Life is held in reserve, blended to just the right degree with death, treated with preservatives, and lavished on the production of works of art that possess a weird eternal life. Action, one might say, perishes with the blossom. Literature is an imperishable flower, and an imperishable flower, of course, is an artificial flower. Thus, to combine action and art is to combine the flower that wilts and the flower that lasts forever. To blend within one individual the two most contradictory desires in humanity and the respective dreams of those desires' realization. What, then, occurs as a result? To be utterly familiar with the essence of these two things, of which one must be false if the other is true, and to know completely their sources and partake of their mysteries, is secretly to destroy the ultimate dreams of one concerning the other. When the action views itself as reality and art as falsehood, it entrusts this falsehood with authority for giving final endorsement to its own truth, and hoping to take advantage of the falsehood, sets it in charge of its dreams. It is thus that epic poems came to be written. On the other hand, when art considers itself as the reality and action as the falsehood, it once more envisages that falsehood as the peak of its own ultimate fictional world. It has been forced to realize that its own death is no longer backed up by the falsehood, that hard on the heels of the reality of its own work came the reality of death. This death is a fearful death, the death that descends on human beings who have never lived, yet he can at last dream, ultimately, of the existence in the world of action, the falsehood of a death that is other than his own. By the destruction of these ultimate dreams, I mean the perception of two hidden truths: that the flower of falsehood dreamed of by the man of action is no more than an artificial flower, and on the other hand, that the death bolstered up by falsehood, of which art dreams in no way confers to any special favors. In short, the dual approaches cuts one off from all salvation by dreams. The two secrets that should never, by rights, have been brought face to face, see through each other. Within one body, and without flinching, the collapse of the ultimate principles of life and death must be accepted. One may well ask if it is possible for anyone to live this duality in practice. Fortunately, it's extremely rare for the duality to assume its absolute form. It is the kind of ideal that, if realized, would be over in a moment. For the secret of this inwardly conflicting ultimate duality is that though it may make itself constantly foreseen in the form of vague apprehension, it will never be put to the test until the moment of death. Then, at the very moment when the dual ideal that offers no salvation is about to be realized, the person who is preoccupied with this duality will betray that ideal from one side or the other. Since it was life that bound him to the ruthless perception of that ideal, he will betray that perception once he finds himself face to face with death. Otherwise, death for him would be unbearable. As long as we are alive, however, we may dally with any type of outlook we choose. A fact that is born out of the constant deaths in sport and the refreshing rebirths that follow. Victory where the mind is concerned comes from the balance that is achieved in the face of ever-imminent destruction. Since my own mind was forever beset by boredom, all but the most difficult, virtually impossible task failed by now to arouse its interest. More specifically, it was no longer interested in anything save the dangerous type of game in which the mind put itself in peril, in the game and in the refreshing shower that followed. At one time, one of the aims of my mind was to know how the man with a massive physique felt about the world around him. This was obviously a problem too great for mere knowledge to handle. For though knowledge may penetrate the darkness by using the many creeping vines of sensation and intuition as guide ropes, here the vines themselves were uprooted. The source that sought to know belonged to me, while the right to the inclusive sense of existence was granted to the other side. A little thought will make this clear. The sense of existence of man with a massive physique must in itself be the kind that embraces the whole world. For that man considered as an object of knowledge, everything outside of himself, including me, must necessarily be transferred onto the objective outside world, experienced by his senses. No accurate picture can be grasped under such circumstances unless one responds with a still more embracing awareness. It is like trying to know how the native of another country experiences existence. In such a case, all we can do is apply inclusive abstract concepts such as mankind, universal humanity, and so on, and to make deductions using these hypothetical yardsticks. This, however, is not an exact knowledge, but a method that leaves the ultimately unknowable elements untouched, and deduces by analogy with the other shared elements. The real question is staved off. The things one really wants to know are shelved. The only other alternative is for the imagination to take over unashamedly and adorn the other side with a whole variety of poems and fantasies. For me, however, all fantasy has suddenly vanished. My bored mind had been chasing after the unintelligible, when abruptly the mystery disintegrated. Suddenly it was I who had the fine physique. Thus, those who had been on the other side of the stream were here, on the same side as myself. The riddle had gone. Death maintained the only mystery. And since this freedom from riddles had been in no way a product of the mind, the latter's pride was terribly hurt. Somewhat defiantly, it began to yawn once more. Once more began to sell itself to the detested imagination. And the only thing that belonged eternally to the imagination was death. Yet, where's the difference? The deepest sources of the morbid imagination that falls on one by night of the voluptuous imagination, inducer of sensual abandon, lie, one and all, in death. How does that death differ from the glorious death? What distinguishes the heroic from the decadent death? The dual way's cruel withholding of salvation proves that they are ultimately the same, and that the literary ethic and the ethic of action are no more than pathetic efforts of resistance against death and oblivion. What differences there might be resolves itself into the presence or absence of the idea of honor, which regards death as something to be seen. In the presence or absence of the formal aesthetic of death that goes with it. In other words, the tragic nature of the approach to death and the beauty of the body going to its doom. Thus, where a beautiful death is concerned, men are condemned to inequalities and degrees of fortune, commiserate for the inequalities and degrees of fortune bestowed on them by their fate at their birth. Though this inequality is obscured nowadays by the fact that modern man is almost devoid of desire of the ancient Greeks to live beautifully and die beautifully. Why should a man be associated with beauty only through a heroic violent death? In ordinary life, society maintains a careful surveillance to ensure that men shall have no part in beauty. Physical beauty in the male, when considered as an object in itself without any intermediate agent, is despised, and the profession of the male actor, which involves constantly being seen, is far from being accorded true respect. A strict rule is imposed where men are concerned. It is this: a man must, under normal circumstances, never permit his own objectivization. He can only be objectified through the supreme action, which is, I suppose, the moment of death, the moment when, even without being seen, the fiction of being seen and the beauty of the object are permitted. Of such is the beauty of the Suicide Squad, which is recognized as beauty not only in the spiritual sense, but by men in general, in an ultra-erotic sense also. Moreover, serving as agent in this case is a heroic action of intensity, beyond the resources of the ordinary mortal, so that objectivization without an agent is not possible here. However, close mere words may get to the moment of supreme action that acts as an intermediary for beauty, they can no more overtake it than a flying body can attain the speed of light. But what I was trying to describe here was not beauty. To discuss beauty is to discuss the question in depth. This was not my intention. What I sought to do was to arrange a great variety of ideas like dice of hard ivory and to set limits to the function of each. I discovered then that the profoundest depths of the imagination lay in death. It is natural, perhaps, that quite apart from the necessity to prepare defenses against the encroachments of the imagination, I should have conceived the idea of turning the imagination that had so long tormented me back on itself, changing it into something that I could use as a weapon for counterattack. However, where art as such was concerned, my style had built already forts here, there, and everywhere, and was successfully holding the encroachments of the imagination in check. If I was to plan such a counterattack, it must take place in some field outside of that art. It was this, more than anything, that first drew me towards the idea of the martial arts. At one time, I had been the type of boy who leaned at the window, forever watching out for unexpected events to come crowding in towards him. Though I might be unable to change the world myself, I could not but hope that the world could change of its own accord. As that kind of boy, with all the accompanying anxieties, the transformation of the world was an urgent necessity for me. It nourished me from day to day. It was something without which I could not have lived. The idea of the changing world was as much a necessity as sleep and 3 meals a day. It was the womb that nourished my imagination. What followed in practice was, in one sense, a transformation of the world. In another, it was not. Even though the world might change into the kind I hoped for, it lost its rich charm at the very instant of change. The thing that lay at the far end of my dreams was extreme danger and destruction. Never once had I envisaged happiness. The most appropriate type of daily life for me was a day-to-day world destruction. Peace was the most difficult and abnormal state to live in. Unfortunately, I lacked the physical wherewithal to cope with this. Wearing upon my sleeve a susceptibility that knew no way of resistance, I watched out for the unexpected, telling myself that when it came, I would accept it rather than struggle with it. Much later, I realized that if the psychological life of this excessively decadent youth had happened to be backed up by strength and the will to fight, it would have constituted a perfect analogy with the life of the warrior. It was an oddly exhilarating discovery. In making it, I put within my grasp the opportunity to turn the imagination back on itself. If the only natural world, for me, was one in which death was an everyday self-evident matter, and if what was natural to me was very easily attainable, not through artificial devices, but by means of perfectly unoriginal concepts of duty, then nothing could be more natural than that I should gradually succumb to temptation and seek to replace imagination by duty. No moment is so dazzling as when everyday imaginings concerning death and danger and world destruction are transformed into duty. To do this, however, required the nurturing of the body, of the strength and the will to fight, and the techniques to fight with. Their development could be entrusted to the same type of methods as had once served to develop the imagination. For were not the imagination and swordsmanship the same insofar as they were techniques nurtured by a familiarity with death? Both were techniques, moreover, that led one closer and closer towards destruction the more sensitive they became. I now realized that the kind of task in which to burnish the imagination for death and danger comes to have the same significance as burnishing the sword had long been called to me from a distance. Only weakness and cowardice had made me avoid it. To keep death in mind from day to day, to focus each moment upon inevitable death, to make sure one's worst forebodings coincided with one's dreams of glory. If that was all, then it was sufficient to transfer the world of the flesh what I had long been doing in the world of the spirit. I've already written of how assiduously I was making preparations for accepting such a wrenching change, getting myself ready to accept it at any time. The theory that anything could be recovered had come into being within me, as it had become clear that even the body, ostensibly the prisoner of time and its moment-to-moment growth and decline, could be recovered. Then it was not odd that I should conceive the idea of time itself as recoverable. For me, the idea that time was recoverable meant that beautiful death, that earlier eluded me, had also become possible. What was more, during the past 10 years, I had learned strength. I had learned suffering, battle, and conquest. I had learned the courage to accept them with all joy. I was beginning to dream of my capabilities as a fighting man. And I believe that is where we will end it today. We are a good little bit amount over halfway. So I will continue this tomorrow and finish it. Somewhere around 40 pages left. And we are 60 pages exactly in. So we will definitely be able to finish tomorrow. Anyways, if you have joined me, thank you for joining me. Tune in tomorrow to see the conclusion. I appreciate anybody who has listened to this. Please like and subscribe. Leave a comment if you would like. I enjoy speaking with the occasional person who leaves a comment, and we have a very good discussion on this channel. Well, anyways, I have been Livid Anglo, Livid Alpha, Wife of Nationalism. And this has been Sun and Steel by Yukio Mishima. Thank you for joining me today. Tenno Heikaban.